Hey Joel, this is Chip from the Oregon-California Trails Association, returning your call. Yeah, I got your number from Karen. Yeah, she's awesome, isn't she? So yeah, I'm out here in the Pacific Northwest, documenting trail history, the Cowlitz, immigration, all that fun stuff. Thought I'd do a short little bio piece on George Washington Bush while I was out here. Oh, no way. No way. No, that's awesome. You're just blowing my mind right now. No, that's great. What, now I gotta go make 2 videos though. No. Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm Chip, a historian here at the Oregon-California Trails Association. Last fall, I was out in the Seattle-Tacoma Olympia area to document early immigrant and trail history in the Pacific Northwest. Now, what I thought was going to be a trip to some local museums and some meetings with some historical groups led to a discovery that reframed my entire trip out there. This is Karen Johnson, curator of the Schmidt House and the Olympia Tumwater Foundation. Karen is also an OCTA member and an expert in the expansionist era of the Pacific Northwest.
George Bush was one of the, I say, most well-known people that pioneered this area, which is Tumwater, Washington, just south of Olympia, Washington, the capital. George was famous for being very generous with his time and money and talents. He was also in the first party of Americans to come to this area, so really helped found and establish the city of Tumwater. George was an African American, as far as we know. His genealogy is a little bit clouded, but we'll talk more about that later.
Early trail historian Edward S. Meany in 1916 wrote that George Bush is one of the first and certainly the greatest men of his race in the history of the state. The state being what would become Washington.
So there's a lot about George that we're not sure of. We don't really know when he was born. I'd say around 1790, but there's some question about that. But his mother was definitely Irish. She worked for a family in the Pittsburgh area. Some people say that he served in the War of 1812. We're not certain of that because there aren't any records that show that he did. There is a lot of misinformation about George. In fact, you can see in this picture up here, which is a sketch of George that was done in 1969. Nobody knows what George Bush really looked like because there were no photos taken of him. Photography existed in his lifetime, but for some reason we have no existing photos of him or his wife Isabella.
Historians have no known portrait of George Bush. We don't. The photographers weren't in the area at the time, and we'll get into this more in next week's video. In the words of the illustrator, this is an image of a generic black man. The artist worked for the Los Angeles Times newspaper, which at the time was running a series on famous African Americans in U.S. history. George
also might have worked for a fur trading company out of Missouri, and he may have traveled as far west as the Washington area, 1820 or so. But we're not sure about that either. What we do know is that he married Isabella James in Missouri in 1830 and decided to come west because even at that time, although George had a job back in Missouri, he was starting to get impacted by the fact that he was African American, and some people didn't like that. He and some friends decided to come west in 1844.
As with a lot of history, the past is complicated, and so George Bush may have served in the War of 1812. He may have worked for a fur company that came out to the Pacific Northwest in the 1820s, a couple decades before he and his family immigrated out there. What we do know is that he married Isabella James O'Brien in Missouri in 1830, and 14 years later, they were wealthy enough to finance their portion of the Bush-Simmons party that traveled out to the Pacific Northwest in 1844. Tax records show that George and Isabella were in St. Joseph, Missouri from 1836 to 1844. These same records indicate that they had some personal wealth to them, enough to bankroll their trip out west. So George and Isabella came west with the Bush-Simmons party, and some historians credit the Bush-Simmons party as having been largely responsible for the immigrant settlements north of the Columbia River, present-day state of Washington.
There were 31 people in George Bush's wagon train, which was usually known as the Bush-Simmons train, and they eventually made their way to the Portland, Oregon City area, and They were going to stay south of the Columbia River, which is the dividing line between what's currently Oregon State and Washington State. But Oregon didn't want blacks in the community, and so they enacted a lash law where black Americans who stayed in the area more than 6 months were subject to public whippings. Luckily, that law didn't stay on the books for too long, and in fact it was never enacted or never took place. No one was ever publicly lashed. But when they got here, George and his friends in the wagon train decided that they couldn't stay here. They didn't want George to be subject to lashings. So their choice was to go south to the Mexico area or come north of the Columbia River. North of the Columbia River was still Oregon territory, but the law didn't bother much to come north of the river.
Isabella was crucial to George and the party's success. She was a nurse and would help tend to the sick and wounded along the journey on the Oregon Trail, as well as watch after the children of those parents who became sick along the way. And once the party was out west and settled near what is now Tumwater, she established a farm and helped build the schoolhouse.
But George was an exceptionally generous and kind man. He had some wealth. He had seed that he had brought with him. He had a good amount of food, and he had money. So when other settlers on the Oregon Trail reached this area, if they were in hard times, George would lend them seed. He would help them clear their land. He would lend them the use of a wagon or oxen or even horses to help them get established.
Isabella also brought an extensive library of seeds and saplings with her from Missouri. There's a tree outside of the Capitol building there in Washington that is from the lineage of one of the trees she brought out here.
Since he was African American, he was not allowed to own land. Even under the Donation Land Claim Act, he could not own land, although white men and white women could own up to 640 acres of land.
So once George and Isabella were settled out in the Tumwater area, Isabella helped with the farming. She helped raise livestock, she helped with the fruits and vegetables, and she even acquired turkeys from the Hudson Bay Company at Fort Nisqually. Isabella had a great relation with the natives. She would trade with them, she would help nurse them and tend to them when sick and wounded, and in fact she even learned Chinook, the local language, to be able to better communicate with everyone.
In fact, he was so well liked by the population around here that his friends and neighbors petitioned Congress, U.S. Congress, to make an exception in George Bush's case and allow him and his wife Isabella to own land. And Congress, in fact, approved that. So because of that, Bush and his family were able to own 640 acres of land. But this is the area that George and Isabella owned, and it's prairie land. And after George had been here for a few years, this became known locally as Bush Prairie, obvious name for it. Just a gentle, pretty much flat landscape, a little bit of roll to it. Bush and his family were growing quite a few different things. They, for one thing, grew hops, believe it or not, for use in beer. And they must have had some early breweries, or they were probably brewing beer at home. He also grew a great number of grains, corn, and the like.
So Karen, before we met and started filming, gave me the number of her friend Jewel that works at the Washington State Archives there in Olympia. And the day before I was scheduled to meet with Karen, Jewel gave me a call that completely changed this entire piece.
Of course, George Washington was a pioneer down in Lewis County, and George Bush was up here, and a lot of people try to mush them together as one person.
Jewel is the one who clued me in about the inaccuracies of George Washington Bush and how they're two separate people and how their stories got intertwined and how they were both incredibly great and kind people in their own ways. So join us next time as we meet with Jewel Dunn, a genealogist at the Washington State Archives in Tacoma.